Hello and welcome to Everything's All Right, a bi-monthly podcast for authors and writers with tips, tricks, and challenges to level up your writing skills. I am aslewis, your host, guide, and guru for all things word related. I'm a published science fiction and fantasy author, a published nonfiction author, and a fan fiction enthusiast, which means I'm also a really big nerd. For the past several years, I've been writing everything from multi-million-dollar grant proposals to sci-fi novels to ghostwriting for national leaders and politicians to spoken word poetry and anything and, well, everything in between. And I'm here to help you improve your writing, no matter what type of writing that is. And who doesn't want to get better? So let's get right to it. Hello, and welcome again to the Everything's Alright podcast, episode Say What? Or the episode where we take a good look at character voice. What is character voice? Well, when most people think about it, the first thing you consider when you're considering what the actual distinctive voice your character in a story may have, you think about dialogue. And that is part of what defines and is a recognizable component of a distinct character voice, but it's not the end-all be-all. In fact, it's only one of many considerations you have to work with when you're building what's essentially going to be the taste and tone of your particular character. Now, I did say it's not, simply relying on dialogue, but there is a quote that highlights dialogue as one of the major components that I've always really liked and have utilized when considering my own characters. Famous playwright David Mamet is known for saying, quote, "All good dialogue happens because a character wants a result." And I think he puts too much emphasis on the aspect of dialogue, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But what he does here is he distills the essence of the purpose of having that character voice. Every character wants something. They want to accomplish something, achieve something, win something. Whatever that is, positive or negative, good or bad for them or the world at large, there is something they are out to get. And one of the ways they interact with the world is, of course, going to be their voice. And so that's a major component in them achieving whatever their, intended result is. So if you think of every time your character interacts with another character, whether that be, spoken language or even body language, they're working on trying to get something out of it, some specific result. And so you want to consider how is the best way to achieve that result. And you can think of it this way. If, let's say, you have a messy roommate and you want to get them to and remind them to, pick up after themselves. Well, if the result you want is simply for them to pick up after themselves, you could say the same basic order a million different ways and get a million different results that would include that. You might tell them, "Hey, sloppy man, clean up all your stuff." Okay, not my most clever writing, but I'm on the spot. But or you could say "Hey, roomie, ever since that meeting, we talked about picking up our stuff. Get on that." Or you forgot to clean up again, Steve. Now, each one of those statements, lame as they were, all had the same purpose or same intended purpose of getting the desired result. Roommate cleaning up after himself. But depending on how it was said, would be taken by that roommate any number of ways that can affect that result. They may decide not to clean up out of spite. They may clean up, but now I've marked you as passive aggressive. Anything. And so not only does your character have to make the choice to verbalize their desire by engaging with something or somebody else, but their current emotional state, their general agreeableness, their ability to adapt and behave respectful of social cues. This is all going to affect how they verbalize, how they voice themselves. The desire is the same, but the delivery can change, and the delivery changing is what constitutes character voice. So let's take it back to where the voice is coming from, the character. Characters in a story, whether a novella or a novel, they're not just talking heads. They're, or at least they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be these flat kind of placeholders with a name. They should be people. They're the people in your story, so they should reflect as much as possibly can on a written page a person in every sense and form. That means that character in its own way needs to have an amalgamation of motivations, intentions, social influences, and lived experiences that dictate or at least shape how they interact, how they speak, how they behave, what body language they display. Just like in real life, those are the same things, motivations, intentions, social influences, and lived experiences that affect how we interact with one another. They are representing people, if not specifically or historically, but in the sense of complete human beings. And the closer you can get to your characters embodying that outlook, that human being is on the page outlook, the more your readers are able to immerse themselves in your story and accept it, on the terms that are given. Even if you're doing something like fantasy, where the every aspect of the world itself, the galaxy in which they live, is turned on its head or different, if they can still identify with your characters on a human level, in that they reflect the depth and variability of humanity, then they'll go that ride with you, and they'll do so happily. Now, that's not saying that you have to know every single moment in detail of each of your characters' lives. You would never complete a story, because we're always slightly changing and evolving as a person. But you do want to have enough material that the gaps that are presented, or may come up during the course of the story, are overshadowed by the wealth of information we do have. And just like, you know, in real life when we're dealing with other people or even ourselves, we don't know everything there is to know about them or us. So you have to just give them enough to be comfortable that this is a person. It's just a person I am still getting to know. And if you can do that, now you're in a position to hear what that character has to say. And that's what you really want to achieve. You want to be able to hear your character speak. Now, I know myself, that's not always a level I've been able to get to, and I would say probably at least half of my pieces that I've written. But there are half that I have achieved this moment, where I'm not thinking of, what would this character say now that he's in this situation, or that someone has said this to him? How would he respond? Now I hear that character in my head respond for me, and all I have to do is capture it on the page. I know enough about their lives, their backstory, their childhood, their fears, their talents. I know all of this about them, and so I don't have to predict what is going to be said. I just kind of allow my imagination to say it. And when you can get to the point that you can hear your character speak to you, they're providing the voice that you're going to write in. And in the course of that, you will pick up certain things that reflect that character. Like if you know that this character is always walking the line between confidence and arrogance, and every time it tips over, that's when his fortunes turn on him. He's going to speak a certain way. He's not going to demur. He's not going to mumble. He's going to be assertive and forthright and probably a little loud. And you know all these things, but you can't. It's hard sometimes to write loud in your work in terms of dialogue, but the way in which a line is delivered, the words chosen, those things can be read off the page and translated by the reader as, he's yelling or he's at least higher than normal conversational tones. So, hearing it physically in your head, the voices of your characters, that puts you well ahead of the pack and toward the end of forming, creating, defining, and ultimately revising your character's actual voice. Now, you also have to kind of prime your brain to work on this skill, and not just knowing your characters is enough, but you also need to know how dialogue actually reveals itself on the page. So the knowledge of your craft and the knowledge of your character end up combining to give you that voice. Now, there are two camps about how people see written, conversation, what the characters are actually saying. And there's a group that believes that character dialogue is never going to be natural. It's more like, actor dialogue. It's distilled to its most streamlined and beautiful form to accomplish the goal of the film, movie, manuscript, whatever it may be. But there's another party of people that think that real dialogue or dialogue done well is a reflection of normal speak. It is natural, it is problematic, it is full of unnecessary utterances, it's got grammatical errors, but that's natural speech. And so there's no right, wrong, good, bad, better for either choice, but it is a distinctive style that you might want to go ahead and reconcile if you haven't already determined this for yourself, which camp you're trying to write in, because it's the only wrong choice would be the inconsistent one. So I would recommend that you're going for writing that reflects natural speech, or are you looking for the aesthetic, coherency of a piece? And there's crossover, but you still need to kind of have your ideal in mind. If you're leaning toward the distilled aesthetic, perfect form, then I would definitely suggest that you spend some time actually reading some scripts. Can be for plays, can be TV or film, it doesn't really matter. But they're great at distilling dialogue to its necessaries while still retaining character voice. I'd pay attention to whatever TV shows that you favor, particularly if they're dramas. And that also applies to film. Not so much, your focus is not so much what the characters are saying, but what makes what one character says different from another character in the same scene. If character A said this and it had these qualities, it was soft, it was barely coherent, it was mumbled, it followed with body language where they were looking at the ground, versus another character in that scene who was almost yelling and staring down one particular character. Note the differences, and note how those differences also inform what you know about the character or provide you with new information about a character that maybe you were suspicious about. But I would definitely start enjoying those media moments, but with a new, keener observation or observational eye. If you're leaning toward doing more natural and realistic dialogue, then I would say you need to go out and sit in coffee shops when it's safe, uh, or some place where you can social distance, but still be in earshot of humanity and listen to conversations. However, let me put this PSA out there. Please do not eavesdrop on conversations that are A, obviously confidential, or that make you look in any way creepy. I am not responsible for any amount of creepiness you get for listening to people in public. That is all. Now, that said, people watching has always been known to be helpful to writers, but I would say people listening is just as helpful, because you don't know these people, but as you listen to what they say, how they say it, you can start to form an idea of what type of person this is. Now, ultimately, you won't know if you're right or wrong. Doesn't matter. If you can connect the dots, then you can help your readers connect the dots. Also, keep in mind that character voices, can change. Whatever your original design for them, that can evolve and grow over the course of your writing. Particularly, I'm thinking of you novelists at the moment. But as experience shapes the voice, it continues to shape the voice as they continue to have experiences in your world or in your story. So don't be afraid when the voice that you're hearing, starts to take on slightly different qualities. That just means your character is growing, and that growth is real enough to affect the all the aspects of that character. Also, keep in mind that in a scene, characters in general do not talk to themselves. They tend to interact with other characters in that scene. So who they're talking to at any given moment, and to some extent the place where they're doing having this conversation, but particularly who they're talking to, can change the way they speak in that moment or the way they come across as far as their natural uh, voice indicators or body language can be very different. For example, your character may be a cowboy that's used to going it alone and roughing it and doesn't spend time or money on fancy words, but he will still most likely talk to his mother when he visits her back on the ranch than he would talk to a stranger in the road or the local town bad boy that's always causing trouble and breaking furniture and getting drunk versus a pretty lady he might fancy. He doesn't change who he is, and ultimately certain things are always going to be present just as part of his personality. But there will be subtle changes in the way he engages with these people, and those changes are generally seen on the page through the description of body language and dialogue. So always be cognizant of the other person in the room with your character who is engaging with them in dialogue, and make sure that's on your radar as you plot what they're going to say. Now we've kind of talked around it, or I've kind of talked around, there are things that you can do to manipulate a character's voice once you have an idea of who that character is. So let's discuss what those little manipulators are. What are those knobs and those things that you can tweak and turn and twist to get exactly the combination you want? Well, this is not a complete list, but it should give you a general idea of those variables that can be used to alter character voice. Word choice. Do they tend to pick formal words or more casual, informal words? Are they an American that has a fondness for using archaic words or pronunciation? Do they prefer British pronunciation or British spelling? In this case too. Uh, do they prefer more violent words or softer words that are more or less kind of wishy-washy, the squishy words? Saying the same sentence but with a slightly different word choice, just like it causes a different emotional tone to it, it can also reflect a different character voice, or at least their emotional tone as they're speaking, if not a pattern of behavior. So word choice is definitely something that strongly affects your character voice. Something as simple as how often they use profanity, or do they use profanity at all? Is it sprinkled in, like salt? Or does it happen every so often, like, you hit a pepper in the middle of your food? Or is it not there at all, and the meal's still tasty, but maybe lacks a little spice? But your use or exclusion of profanity can definitely affect character voice. Maybe whether the character is optimistic or pessimistic. If they're an optimist, she may look for the bright side on even the most dire situations, even when it's ridiculous to do so because it seems like all hope is lost. But that's the kind of person she is, and so that will reflect in, her actual speaking. Even if, she doesn't believe it herself. But it's just who she is. Or pessimistic. No matter how great things are going, all of her stuff, anything that she says or engages in will seem on its surface level like it's positive, but if you really think about it, didn't they just diss this? That's the kind of tone that you would want to reflect in her voice, or her voice should reflect that kind of tone, because that's who we've established his character is. Uh, Other more mechanical things like the rhythm of the sentence, The sentence structure itself, the sentence order, all of these can affect character voice and make it distinctive or not distinctive. For example, George Lucas, Yoda. No one will mistake someone sounding like Yoda, or I can't tell in the dialogue who's speaking. Is that Yoda or Obi-Wan? Yoda's speech pattern is highly unique, or at least in the Western world, it's highly unique because of its word order. And so it makes everything sound cryptic, which gives him an extremely uh, aberrant but extremely useful tool for making his voice distinctive, as distinctive as befits such a character, because we're dealing with a several hundred-year old tiny alien that can kick major butt. So he had needed something that was as different and strong a character for his character voice, and it works because everyone knows the Yoda speak. Now, that said, I feel it is incumbent upon me to issue this fair warning. I know some of you are thinking that, well, why don't you use accents to, make your character distinctive? Yes, you can do that. You can use, accents or regional dialect or other patois to indicate that character voice. But it is a very difficult thing to do well, and an easy thing to do that will offend. If you are insistent that this is the voice you need, when I say having an accent in the written form, I mean that dialogue is written in such a way as to phonetically reflect that dialect or accent or patois. So if you're going to do that, number one, I'd say think about, is it necessary for your story? And if the answer is yes, yes it is necessary, then by all means go that route. There are authors have done this and done it absolutely beautifully. But the amateur writer will screw it up. And if it actually makes it to publication, you run a risk of offending, a whole region or nationality or ethnicity or community of people that wasn't your intent. So, number one, be sure. If you're certain. Number two, do your research. Make sure you're getting an accurate representation of the dialect that you are trying to reflect on the page. So, certainty and accuracy. And last thing, get a beta reader specifically for that purpose. It's sensitivity readers, or sometimes they're called, to make sure that you've gotten that line of artistic representation versus caricature or stereotype. So it's always good to have someone read for that specific eye. At the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. Or in this case, character description of action can often speak much louder than the dialogue that is given to the character. Body language is powerful for communicating much of what you need your characters to communicate to either achieve their goal or betray it. Either way, it's a much richer and just wonderful resource and wealth to utilize to help present your character to the world. So now that we have a better idea of what character voice is, what it's composed of, how it can be manipulated and tweaked to serve its own purpose, let's look at how you actually create the character voice. What are the practical ways in achieving that kind of synchrony between the author and the character, that their voice comes through loud and clear? Well, stay tuned for some tips and tricks on how to do just that. Here are some tips and tricks to help you create a character that has a clear and distinct character voice. We're going to do this one a little bit differently. I'm not going to so much count off different tips and or tricks that can be applied, but instead make a suggestion of an activity to engage in to help accomplish this. In this case, I would say character interviews can be priceless when it comes to making sure that that voice comes through loud and clear and is distinctive from other characters within your work. This can be as simple and streamlined as a profile, or more detailed and involved and in depth like than an interview. And I'll go over kind of tactics for both. If you create a character profile, and I highly recommend you do this for any main characters in your piece of writing, you want to consider things like age, nationality, and I mean specific nationality down to the neighborhood or community in which they grew up, not just the country of origin. Their educational history, what kind of grades they made, because that's going to have an effect on them as an adult to some extent. Their work experience and whether some of that work experience was super short, super long, physical labor, intellectual property work, whatever it was will have a shape on it. So be as specific as possible. Any of their talents, their flaws, and some of the most formative or notable life experiences, like obvious things like trauma where they're abused or had PTSD, but happy things like are they married, the wedding day or the honeymoon, or the birth of their first child, or the time a pet died. Any of those notable, formative, memorable experiences you want to have an immediate and concrete grasp of. So at a minimum, these are the things I would put in a character profile, and I would answer each and every entry as specifically as you possibly can. I'm not saying that these details will show up specifically in your story or be bluntly written down, but you, as the author, need to have the answers to these questions because they will affect and influence the voice with which your character speaks. Now, if you want to take it a step further, you can conduct a character interview, and that is the same premise as the profile, except the questions go deeper, and what you're trying to do is not so much interview yourself for the answers for this character. Instead, you want to interview the character and imagine that that character is giving you the answer as if you were conducting an interview. So you might ask your character what experience defines their life, and you want to think as if you were the character when you're responding. What would that pivotal experience be? What would that character's answer be? You created them, so you know everything there is to know about them. You just now have to think in specifics. Things that were kind of nebulous in your consideration, make specific. Pull out that memory. Come up with an answer for that character. What does your character value most? What do they fear most? What are their hopes for the future? What do they want to achieve? How would their best friend describe them in a single word? These questions are the ones that are harder because you're not answering, like I said, for the character, you're answering as them. But forcing yourself to get into their headspace will ultimately help you stay in that space when you need to be there. And that's what will help ensure that your character ultimately has a clear, distinctive, and more importantly, consistent character voice throughout your piece. Now, let's put our pens where our words are and put what we've learned into practice. Here is your bi-weekly Wordsmith challenge. In 500 words or less, I want you to write a brief paragraph describing a chosen character's backstory. You can start it from anywhere. You can have the person telling the story themselves. You can be writing it in the third person, but something that is a snapshot of their entire life or just maybe a part of their childhood or an anecdotal thing that happened to them, but something that contributes to the backstory and the complex weave that makes that character that way. To enter our challenge contest, just send your description in to aslewisbooks@gmail.com with the subject line character voice. The winner's piece will be posted on the A.S. Lewis Books website, and we'll give a shout out to them in a future podcast episode. And speaking of winners, let's see the winning entry for the Point of View Challenge. And the winner is Milo D for his entry of point of view in the second person. You won't be found this time, not first. This time, you know you picked the best space. Behind the living room curtain, that's a baby's hiding space. Under the dining room table, what are you, 3? No, you're 5 now, a big boy. You even go to school now with backpacks, teachers, and everything. So this time, you're going to play like a big boy you are, in the kitchen cabinet. No toes out for you, no giggles to give away your spot. You could have gone under the bed, but that's where the monsters live. Not that you're afraid, but who wants to hide next to a monster? You're a brave big boy, but monsters? No way. Congratulations, Milo. Keep up the good work. Next episode, we will highlight the winner for setting and description as well as character voice. And remember, if you send in your work, it could be you featured on another episode of the podcast. And if you don't want to share your work, that's okay too. The important thing is that you're writing and trying something new. That's how writing gets better. Even if you hate what you wrote, I promise you the practice will pay off. If you've enjoyed the show and would like to hear more, please click subscribe so you never miss an episode. Keep writing, and remember, everything's all right.